Right now, while you are reading this, the Third World War is not coming. It is already here. It just does not look the way Hollywood promised you it would look. There are no mushroom clouds on every horizon. There is no single red button being pressed by one man in a bunker. What is happening is quieter than that, and far more dangerous. Because quiet wars do not trigger the survival instinct. They bypass it. Proxy armies are grinding cities into rubble on 3 continents. Supply chains that took 70 years to build are being dismantled in a matter of months. Currencies that once represented the wealth of nations are being weaponized, sanctioned, and cut off from the global system, and the civilians caught in the middle. Ordinary people who went to bed one night in a functioning country and woke up in something unrecognizable. They did not have a warning. Nobody knocked on their door to say, "Prepare yourself." This is what total societal collapse actually looks like before it reaches your neighborhood. It looks like rising prices. It looks like empty shelves in certain aisles. It looks like internet outages, quiet banking restrictions, and government language that suddenly becomes vague about things it used to be very specific about. By the time it looks like what you expect, the window for smart preparation has already closed. The brutal truth is that FEMA was never designed to prepare you for this. FEMA exists to manage aftermath. It exists to coordinate cleanup, distribute bottled water, and process paperwork after something has already happened. It is a reaction machine, not a preparation machine. And in a scenario where multiple interconnected systems fail simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of cascading collapse that modern warfare is engineered to produce. FEMA is not coming, not fast enough, not with enough, not to you specifically. The science of large-scale system failure is not a theory. It is documented history. When the power grid went down in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, hospitals ran out of generator fuel within 72 hours. When supply chains fractured in Venezuela during its economic collapse, the caloric intake of the average citizen dropped by over 30% in a single year. When war reached Syria, it did not announce itself with a single catastrophic moment. It arrived in layers, each one stripping away another piece of the infrastructure people depended on to survive. The people who made it through those scenarios were not the ones who waited for help. They were the ones who had already, quietly, without anyone telling them to, started thinking about what they would do when the system around them stopped working. So this is your field guide. Not a comfort piece. Not a list of platitudes about staying calm. This is the step-by-step science-driven breakdown of what you actually need to do right now, before the moment arrives when doing it becomes impossible. The first thing you need to understand is water, and you need to understand it with the same seriousness that a physicist understands gravity. The human body begins to suffer cognitive decline within 24 hours of dehydration. Within 72 hours, organ systems start shutting down. The math is non-negotiable. A person needs roughly 2 liters of clean water per day just to maintain basic function, more if they are under physical stress, more still in heat. Now do the math for your household. Multiply by 30 days. That is the absolute minimum buffer you need to have stored before any large-scale disruption. But storage alone is not the strategy. The strategy is regeneration. Because stored water runs out. What does not run out is your ability to process water from available sources. If you understand the science of how contamination works, boiling water kills biological threats. A rolling boil for 1 full minute eliminates virtually every pathogen that can harm a human being. But heat does not remove chemical contamination, heavy metals, or fuel runoff. For those, you need filtration. The simplest effective filter you can build from urban salvage is a layered system using activated carbon, which you can produce yourself by charring hardwood at high temperature in a loxygen environment, followed by a fine sand layer, followed by a gravel pre-filter. This is not primitive. This is the same principle used in municipal water treatment, just scaled down. The activated carbon binds to organic chemicals and heavy metals through a process called adsorption. The sand traps fine particulates. The gravel catches the larger debris before it clogs the layers below. If you add a final treatment of calcium hypochlorite, which is the active ingredient in pool shock at a ratio of 1/8 teaspoon per gallon of clear water, you have a complete purification system assembled entirely from materials available in any hardware store or urban salvage site. This is not optional knowledge. This is the difference between drinking water and drinking a slow death. The second preparation is food, but not the kind of food prepper culture traditionally fixates on. Forget the fantasy of a warehouse full of freeze-dried meals. In a genuine societal collapse, bulk and obvious stockpiles make you a target. The science of caloric density is what matters. You are looking for foods that pack the maximum available energy into the minimum possible space, and weight, that require no refrigeration, that have a multi-year shelf life, and that will not betray your position if someone else is hungry and looking. Rolled oats, white rice, sealed in mylar bags, with oxygen absorbers. Honey, which has no expiration date because its chemistry creates an environment hostile to microbial growth. Hard lentils, ghee, clarified butter, which stays stable without refrigeration for up to a year in sealed containers. A kilogram of rolled oats contains roughly 3,500 A person needs around 2,000 kilocalories per day to maintain body weight under moderate activity. Do that math across a family of 4, and you will understand immediately how differently you need to be thinking about food than you currently are. Beyond calories, you need to think about the nutrients that the human body cannot synthesize on its own. Vitamin C deficiency produces scurvy within 4 to 6 weeks. The historical record of long sea voyages, military sieges, and prison camp survival is soaked in that particular misery. Pine needle tea, which you can make from almost any non-toxic conifer, contains more vitamin C per cup than orange juice. Sprouting seeds, something you can do in a glass jar with a mesh lid, produces live food rich in enzymes and vitamins from nothing more than dry seeds and water in 3 to 5 days. These are not survival tricks. These are biochemistry applied to crisis conditions. The knowledge costs you nothing. The gap between knowing it and not knowing it is the difference between maintaining immune function and becoming sick at exactly the moment your access to medical care is gone. The third step is energy. And the single most important thing to understand about energy in a grid-down scenario is the hierarchy of priority. Heat comes before electricity. A dead phone is an inconvenience. Hypothermia is a cause of death. The human body maintains a core temperature of roughly 37 degrees Celsius through continuous metabolic process. When the ambient environment drops, and that process is disrupted by inadequate shelter or clothing, the body begins diverting blood flow away from extremities to protect core organs. Fine motor skills degrade. Judgment deteriorates. Decision-making becomes impaired at the exact moment when good decisions are most critical. The solution is layering, not a single heavy garment. Multiple thin layers trap air between them, and trapped air is the insulation. Wool retains thermal properties even when wet, which synthetic fibers generally do not. A wool base layer, a mid-layer fleece, and a wind-blocking outer shell is a system that will keep a human being alive in brutal conditions at essentially zero ongoing cost. For electrical energy, solar is the only genuinely scalable decentralized option. A 100-watt panel, a charge controller, and a 100 mAh lithium iron phosphate battery forms a system that will cost you a few $100s today and provide enough electricity to run LED lighting, charge communication devices, and power a small water pump indefinitely. Lithium iron phosphate chemistry is specifically significant here because it tolerates partial state of charge without degradation. It does not require active cooling, and it has a cycle life of over 2,000 charge cycles compared to the 200 to 300 cycles, typical of flooded lead-acid batteries. This is not a luxury. This is infrastructure you build before the moment you need it. The fourth step is medical. And the honest truth about medicine in a grid-down scenario is that the vast majority of people will not die from dramatic injuries. They will die from infections. A wound that becomes septic. A respiratory illness that escalates unchecked. A tooth infection that spreads to the jaw. The human immune system is extraordinarily capable when it has nutritional support, clean water, and rest. The failures happen at the edges, when a small problem is left unaddressed because the infrastructure to treat it no longer functions. This means your medical preparation needs to center on wound care and infection prevention more than on anything else. Irrigation of wounds with clean water under pressure removes more bacteria than any topical antiseptic. Honey, specifically raw honey, has clinically documented antibacterial properties and has been used as a wound dressing in controlled medical studies. Colloidal silver, sugar paste, and diluted iodine are all documented wound treatment options with centuries of recorded use. Beyond wound care, the ability to manage fever, which is the body signaling active immune response to infection, is critical. Willow bark contains salicin, the compound from which aspirin was chemically derived. Elderflower promotes sweating and helps break fever. Garlic contains allicin, which has documented antimicrobial activity. None of these replace pharmaceutical medicine. But in their absence, they are not nothing. They are applied botany, rooted in the same biochemical mechanisms that pharmaceutical companies later isolated, synthesized, and put in bottles with dosage instructions. Know them. The fifth step is communication, and this one is counterintuitive because the first instinct in a collapse scenario is to reach for a phone. Phones are dependent on cell towers. Cell towers are dependent on the grid. When both fail, a smartphone becomes a very expensive paperweight. The only communication technology that remains functional in a full infrastructure collapse is radio. Specifically, hand crank or battery-powered AM/FM. Shortwave receivers give you access to broadcast signals that travel hundreds and in some cases thousands of miles. Ham radio, which requires a license to transmit but not to receive, forms the backbone of civilian emergency communication in disaster zones around the world. A basic handheld ham radio transceiver running on a charged battery can coordinate with other prepared individuals across a metropolitan area with no infrastructure dependency whatsoever. The physics of radio waves do not care whether the grid is up. The sixth step is location intelligence, and this is where urban survival diverges most sharply from the wilderness survival mythology that dominates prepper culture. In a city, the threats are human, not environmental. The danger is not hypothermia in a forest. It is the crowd dynamic that forms when food distribution breaks down in a dense population. Crowd dynamics follow predictable patterns that have been studied extensively by sociologists and emergency management researchers. In the first 72 hours of a supply disruption, most people remain cooperative. They are in a holding pattern, waiting for authority figures to restore order. From day 4 through day 10, cooperative behavior begins to fracture as physiological needs intensify. After day 10, in the absence of restored supply chains, community structures either solidify into mutual aid networks or fragment into competition. The trajectory depends almost entirely on the actions of the first people who organize. This means your urban survival strategy needs to account for movement windows. The first 24 to 48 hours of any major disruption represent the safest possible window for repositioning. Roads are still passable. Social order is still holding. The population is in a shock state that temporarily suppresses impulsive behavior. If you need to leave an urban area, this is your window. Waiting for certainty means waiting until the window has closed. Know your routes before you need them. Identify 3 exit options from your location, at minimum, using maps that do not require internet access. A laminated physical map of your metropolitan area, marked with the locations of water sources, medical facilities, and the routes between them. Costs almost nothing and weighs almost nothing and is completely immune to infrastructure failure. The 7th step is the most important and the least discussed, which is psychological architecture. Survival psychology is not about being tough. It is about understanding how the human brain processes extreme stress and building mental habits that counteract the failure modes that stress produces. The human brain, under acute threat, defaults to one of 3 primary responses: fight, flight, or freeze. The freeze response, the one nobody talks about in action movie survival scenarios, is statistically the most common and the most dangerous. People who freeze in genuine emergencies do not freeze because they are cowards. They freeze because the brain, overwhelmed by threat signals without a clear path forward, enters a kind of protective shutdown while it seeks pattern recognition to match the new reality against anything familiar. The antidote to freeze is not courage, it is preparation. A brain that has already mentally rehearsed a response to a scenario does not need to search for a pattern. It already has one. This is why written plans, rehearsed actions, and pre-assigned roles within a family or community group are not excessive. They are neuroscience applied to crisis management. A child who knows that when the power goes out, the first job is to fill the bathtub from the tap before water pressure drops, is not a child who will freeze. They are a child with a pattern to match. Adults with a printed protocol for the first 72 hours of a grid-down event are not paranoid. They are exercising the same mental discipline that military units, emergency medical teams, and flight crews exercise every single day as a matter of professional standard. The chaos of a crisis does not become less chaotic because you are smart or experienced or calm in normal conditions. It becomes manageable only when the response to it has already been built, rehearsed, and internalized before the moment of crisis arrives. There is also the emotional weight of watching a social system collapse around you. This is not a minor consideration. The psychological literature on disaster survivors is consistent on one point. The people who maintain functional, emotional regulation under prolonged stress are not the ones who suppress their fear. They are the ones who have a framework that gives the fear a place to live without consuming their ability to act. Journaling. Pre-agreed decision trees. Shared purpose within a group. These are not soft skills. These are the mechanisms by which human beings have maintained sanity through some of the most catastrophic events in recorded history. People who survived the siege of Leningrad, people who outlasted years in prisoner of war camps, people who rebuilt communities after floods, earthquakes, and wars. They did not do it by being fearless. They did it by having something to organize their fear around. A goal, a person, a responsibility, a belief that their actions in the present moment had meaning in a future they were working to reach. The world you are living in right now is not stable. This is not pessimism. This is pattern recognition applied to documented historical cycles of empire, resource competition, and systemic stress. The global systems that most people in developed nations depend on for their food, their water, their energy, and their communication were built on assumptions of cooperation that are actively eroding. You do not have to believe in any particular political ideology to see that the supply chains are under stress, that the energy systems are contested, and that the pre-institutional responses to these pressures have been consistently slower and less effective than the pressures themselves require. What you choose to do with that observation is entirely your decision. But understand this, and understand it clearly. The difference between the person who survives what is coming and the person who does not is not luck. It is not strength, it is not wealth, and it is not location. It is the gap between the person who prepared before the moment of need and the person who waited until the moment of need to begin. That gap is not dramatic. It is not some vast heroic distance. It is 7 steps. It is water, it is food, it is energy, it is medical knowledge, it is communication, it is movement intelligence, it is psychological architecture. These are not extraordinary things. They are things that every generation of human beings before yours understood as basic competence. The foundational knowledge of how to keep yourself alive when the systems designed to do it for you are no longer available. The question is not whether you will face a moment when those systems are unavailable. History answers that question for you. The only question is whether, when that moment arrives, you will be the person who already knows what to do. Start today. Not because it is comfortable, not because you are afraid. Because preparation is the only gap between the victim and the survivor. And that gap is entirely, completely, unforgivably in your hands right now.